right, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get the session started for today. It is indeed the 17th. We've got, by my clock, about 14 more days till the beginning of the year. And by the PCI clock, we're about 4 or 5 months past, or actually maybe longer than that, about 8 months past what was supposed to be a hard deadline for eSkimming controls. It's probably a good thing, that maybe those of you on this call haven't, completely filled out, your strategy as it relates to this, because I'm going to say some things in this discussion that are fairly provocative. I'm going to say some things that, we're not afraid to say publicly. We're not afraid to say, to the council directly. But I really want to sink some of these ideas into your mind, because I want us to be approaching this issue with the seriousness that it requires. And I think there's some gaps in that right now. So the title of the session is, PCI DSS 4.0.1, delivering a false sense of security against eSkimming. I firmly believe, and we firmly believe here at Source Defense, there are things within it that do that. There are some critically important issues that are lingering here with the DSS, and things that you need to know about in terms of attack surface and attack TTPs, tactics and techniques and procedures, and just general some of the back end of things that have been going on, with the whole 643.11.6.1 over the course of the last year. So I'm going to dive into that, but I want to talk to you just a little bit about who we are and where we get off, how we have the audacity to sort of speak, maybe, sort of in a speak truth to power kind of capacity, on the subject. We have been, focused on eSkimming and eSkimming protections, and really rounding out protection of data at the point of capture for the better part of, I guess, going on about 10 years in market now. We're a web security firm. We are solely focused on this issue. We believe it's a critical issue, that helps enable third-party integration, but we also think it's a massively overlooked item in third-party risk management. And so if you're focused on TPRM, you got to be focused on the website. If you're not focused on, the partners on the website, you're not focused on third-party risk, and you're not focused on really driving down, fraud and data theft at the PII and card data level. So we're pretty adamant about, our position. We think we're addressing both data security and privacy. I'll touch on the privacy aspect of it in just very brief, one slide here as we go along. But I do think it's very important for everyone to understand, because this is not just about, data security. It's about protecting the third-party ecosystem from overreaching and, putting you in jeopardy for other forms of compliance around data privacy and things of that nature. We are a PCI certified solution. We are a PCI PPO. That's a principal participating organization. That means we are heavily engaged, and we actually invest in the PCI Council. We help support the community. We're there at all the events. We actually are a member of, I sit on the PCI Board of Advisors for the 2025 to 2027 session. We're very vocal. We've had a lot of conversations with the organization and with all players in the organization. We aren't just about PCI, though. Our protections extend to GDPR requirements and HIPAA requirements and FFIEC requirements. And we have, a real sort of white hat approach to the world. It is sort of like, how we define ourselves. And so we've developed a bunch of free tools to help support your journey, to educate you around the problem. That's really what today's session is, educational in nature. I'm really not going to touch on the Source Defense product at all, so you're not getting a sales pitch here. But we do have things that we, want to make available to you, helping you understand scope and helping you look at the problem, not just as a compliance issue, but around security itself, helping you work through decision-making and some of the pitfalls that many, many merchants have dropped themselves into with a, sort of a DIY approach. We're happy to educate. Again, I mentioned we have connections, to the ecosystem. We have back office understanding of what's going on. Happy to come in, educate, the entire stakeholder of team that needs to be pulled in, to this process. Open up the kimono, ask me anything style kind of session. I'll do it. Any member of our team will do it. We'll dedicate that time to you. We have tools for project website assessment. We work with dozens upon dozens upon dozens of QSAs, the firms that QSAs work work for. And so we're happy to do a group working session with you and your QSA to talk through things. And we've got a rapid action plan that help you get this problem solved inside 30 days. So that's sort of like the sum total of what I want to pitch Source Defense behind. I will reiterate those things. I will ask you to take advantage of them because we do want to be here to help. But really want to get into the nuts and bolts of the problem with what's the current focus on this eSkimming problem and what really needs to be done to ensure that this isn't just a compliance checkbox game, but that we're really getting the problem solved. We think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the threat. It ignores guidance in the current version of the DSS from eSkimming experts like ourselves, from PCI PFIs, the forensic investigators that work hand on and see all of the impact of attacks. We think that there's a super over reliance on a myopic understanding and a static understanding of adversarial tradecraft. I will get into that. We do a ton of threat research. Our team is constantly out there. We're seeing new and novel attacks on a daily basis. I'll give you some examples of a couple of those as we go along. We think as a result of what's in the DSS, there's real misguidance to the global community. There's an overemphasis on controls that actually aren't controls, despite a chorus of warnings that have been happening for the better part of a couple of years now. Many of us have been trying to get modifications to the DSS that help not steer merchants and service providers in the wrong direction. I'll dig into that. We think that the focus is too isolated. It isolates it down to what really is the last mile of the attack surface, and I'll talk about what the real attack surface is and how these attacks work and what our adversaries are actually doing. And as a result, it misses the point. There's been a de-scoping that's happened to a critical target community with some changes that were made to the SAC-A, and I'll talk about that. It's a loophole that's been opened up for some of the richest targets in the community, and ultimately it's creating a compliance shell game. And that's not what we're about, right? We're about, when we think about the origins of PCI and what this is all supposed to be about and who we are, whether we're driving risk out as a GRC personnel or security or whatever, it's not about compliance checkbox. It's about security, right? So we don't want just checkboxes. We want security. So I'm going to do a really quick overview on what led to, the eSkimming requirements being added into the DSS. Effectively, it's all about JavaScript and it's all about the modern website. If you go to the people that manage your website right now and you ask them how many partners that they have plugged in, it's going to be a dozen or more, most likely. And it's going to be everything from all your social and your meta pixel. It's going to be chat bots, going to be, analytics tools. It's going to be increasingly like AI bots and things that are there. It's going to be multimedia plugins. Your team didn't design the website. They designed the core of the website, the skeleton of the website, and then they, compiled the website with a bunch of code from third parties. So roughly about 82% of the code that's running on your website isn't yours. You don't have control over it at current. You don't have visibility into, the vulnerabilities that exist within it. If it's compromised, you're at risk. And the bad guys recognize that in around the 2016 timeframe, and that's when they started, basically launching mage card attacks that took advantage of these loopholes. And so fast forward 10 years, and we still have these major loopholes available, such to the point that the card associations are saying effectively this is the largest venue for fraud and data theft and card data theft. It's the card not present environment, it's e-commerce, and it's because of the way the modern website works. Visa has continually warned and continues to warn in all of their threat research, their biannual reports. This is the biggest concern on their mind, and it's got to get addressed. It's what led to the council taking action, right around the 2022 timeframe where they changed the DSS. Visa, this quote I use, it's a bit dated, but I use it because of how specific it is. Visa saying, e-com platforms and the third-party code integrations that are running on them, like all those things I just discussed, are the most common tactics utilized by threat actors. They're targeting the supply chain. We should all be familiar with supply chain risk, right? They're targeting the third parties. So again, back to the whole third party risk management side of things with incredibly high frequency and exhibiting continued interest in payment data and PII. That was all the way back in June of 2022. In 2022, the DSS was first released, or the new version of the DSS was released 4.0. It basically allowed for future data requirements to prevent these eSkimming attacks. Effectively, they gave the community a couple of years to move, 2.5 roughly, and then the deadline to have something in place to be PCI compliant against this threat was April 1st of this year, April 1st of 2025. But the vast majority of merchants still remain unprotected. The vast majority of merchants are non-compliant with this requirement. It wasn't an April Fool's joke. Like, just because that was the date that it happened, you got to get this, taken seriously, and you should do so because it exposes your consumers, it exposes your brand, and ultimately it exposes the global payments ecosystem, to what is the primary source of fraud. So that's my clarion call to say, if you haven't acted, you're not alone, but you need to start getting moving. And a lot of merchants that we've spoken to, we know are kind of in the rock or the SAC A, or the SAC period right now, and they're starting to hear from their QSAs, you're failing this, you got to go get controls in place. As I mentioned up above, we've got a 30-day sort of action plan that we can walk you through to take that off the table so that you're not exposed to an attack and all the potential downstream that might happen. I mentioned that I was going to get into a conversation with you just real briefly around the data leakage aspect of what these third parties, being uncontrolled and unmanaged, present. And here's a really great case example. We see these all the time. This is not the only one. This is just the most recent. This happened right at the beginning of December, or right at the end of November. ChatGPT basically, content of theirs or credential data, PII, things of that nature, were inadvertently shared with a website partner that they had. That website partner was attacked. That data was compromised and stolen. And ChatGPT, is on the hook, right? Because of the fact, or OpenAI is on the hook because of the fact that, they didn't control that third party. This happens every single day. Every single day. There are implementations of Google Analytics, or implementations of chat bots and ad bots and all the things that you might put on your site that you think are doing great things for you, and they are. But there are implementations that are uncontrolled. You don't realize that you're allowing access to sensitive data that, as I mentioned, might be privacy protected. There's a number of examples in the healthcare space of this, where the Meta Pixel was actually deployed, or even Google Analytics in one case was deployed, and millions upon millions of consumers' PHI, their health data, was inadvertently crawled and leaked to those partners, such that, in the Meta example, people are going to their healthcare provider or their insurance provider, and they're interacting with them related to, a sensitive health issue, and then they're going on Instagram and they're getting advertisements run at them, for those health conditions and for the drugs that will help. You got to protect the entire site. I'm going to talk about that as it relates to compliance and security, against the eSkimming threat. But, irrespective of that, in order to protect against that type of data leakage that could compromise your position, you would have to protect the entire site. And, reliance on compliance is not security. The DSS has it wrong in a lot of ways, and I'm going to get into that, right? So what does the DSS say? It says you got to maintain an inventory of all scripts that are running on your website and justify why they are necessary. In fact, it says specifically around the payment pages. You have to confirm that each script is authorized. So it's there. Somebody internal to the organization has said, yep, we're willing to take that risk. You've got to monitor and ensure the integrity of each script. You got to know that it hasn't been compromised. You got to monitor on a weekly basis the payment page headers. And then you have to have a way to alert and respond to your teams, to all malicious scripts that are running on the payment pages. Okay. Those are the requirements. If you didn't know before now, that's a real high level overview of them. We can get into deeper, what are the requirements, in Q&A, but I'm going to move on from that. Now I want to get into where the DSS falls apart, in respect to each of these. So issue number one, as I raised, is controls that don't control. So all throughout the DSS, you're going to see reference examples, referring to content security policy and SRI. Okay. Static resource integrity. Okay. Or site resource integrity. These things basically, are used primarily for homegrown solutions. There are some vendors out there who have tacked on, controls around basically CSP based solutions. Here's some problems with that I'll get into. These are static controls. These are static controls, period, full stop, unable to track and evolve with the attack. Okay. They actually don't really reflect today's current threat landscape. And so a reliance on CSP, not only is it difficult, hard, but it doesn't really do anything for you in terms of protecting against the threat. And I'll get into that a little bit further. I was a part, and so were a bunch of vendors, QSAs, people in the PSP space, the card associations, other vendors in eSkimming, of what was referred to as the EGTF, the E-commerce Guidance Task Force, that the PCI Council impaneled last December and that we worked on through February of this year. 80 people on that task force explicitly warned that there was too much reliance on CSP in the DSS, too much of a reference example, and that it should be removed. It was watered down. There is some guidance that came out. There was a document that we put together as part of that effort that, kind of speaks to some of the pitfalls, but I don't think it really gives the teeth that it really needs. And so this is my warning to you. CSP basically requires continuous updates. It creates breakage of the site. It lacks total behavioral awareness. It is effectively a whitelist of the services that you're going to allow to run, which really I think is kind of absurd, because it's the services that you're going to run that are going to be compromised that will then lead to data theft and to the fraud. So if I am saying, yes, my whitelist includes, this ad service or this chat service, and that chat service is hacked, the door's wide open. Okay. So it's not stopping anything, and it's not responding, to a change in behavior. It's just saying, this is my allowable list of things that can run on the website. Okay. SRI fails kind of silently, and it really cannot keep pace with the way JavaScript works and how scripting works. It's seeking effectively to establish a hash or an identification, a fingerprint of the script that you're allowing to run on the site. Well, that fingerprinting cannot occur because scripts change and the fingerprint then changes, dynamically, time of day, by geography, in response to user actions. It's just an untenable, situation trying to think that you can identify and create an identity for, all of the scripts that are running. We had a client, a very large client out of the UK, multi-product, multinational type organization. They were dealing with something like 11,000 script changes on a monthly basis, and they absolutely could not keep up. And that's why they said, we're abandoning this kind of focus, right? A core author of the DSS, who at one point was with the council and now is in private practice, has openly come out and said, at the time that he advised on creating the DSS, he didn't know enough about this problem. The default was CSP and SRI. That's why it's in there. He wished it could change, but it can't. So there's this misleading nature of what's going on inside the DSS that I'm calling a major red flag on, and I'm trying to alert you on. I don't care if you work with us or not. If you rely on these controls, you're going to get popped in the long run. There is a white paper that my colleague Scott will put in the chat if he hasn't already, around behavioral-based kind of controls, CSP and SRI, and really dissecting, the problems there. But, we have a general call to action. We think that CSP and SRI should be removed as example controls. We think that there should actually be a replacement with kind of explicit warnings against reliance. And we think over time, it should be replaced with real reference controls. So that's, point number one. I'll give you just a little bit of a breakdown in terms of like how CSP works from an architectural perspective. For those who are kind of there, I'm going to make it real layman's, not super technical, but effectively you've got your third party. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, it doesn't really matter. You got your third party on the left-hand side. That third party, is effectively loaded by you, approved by you into the consumer session. Okay. You analyze, you determine that list of trusted locations to load resources from, and you store it on your server. Your server provides that list of locations to the visitor's browser. basically the browser is going to load resources from those locations. You said they're safe, okay? And so as a result, you said it's a green light. It's an open highway, okay? That again, if you do that, flies in the face of the understanding that it is the third party partner that you're working with that gets compromised that leads to these attacks. Okay. There is still first party directly attacking your script, directly attacking your server side on the equation, but the majority of these types of attacks are coming through that supply chain. Okay. So effectively, you're allowing a compromised source code from third parties to interact with the consumer and interact with everything on the website. Okay. Your web provider, okay, got into the SRI side of things. Okay, on the SRI side of things, again, it's a fingerprint. You look at the code, you generate a fingerprint, you create a hash, and you're saying, okay, this is the code that's allowed to run. Again, when that code changes, it's either going to break and not allow code to run, or it's going to just allow it, and you will not have any protections in place. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the rest there. If fingerprints match, it allowed to happen. If the fingerprints don't match, then the third party script won't get loaded. But again, back to the notion of dynamic scripting, they're not going to match, so you're going to break your site every time trying to do something like that. I wanted to walk through, one form of attack that we just saw not too long ago, probably, I don't know, maybe a month ago tops. Okay. And this actually used Google Analytics and hid and disguised itself as Google Analytics. Very much in a lot of the threat activity on this one almost performed like, if for those like with a deep cyber background, like an APT, like an advanced persistent threat, like normally, like a slow and low type of attack that like nation states would try and would try and undertake. They basically use one of the most trusted brands, Google Analytics, to establish long-term presence on the victim checkout pages. So they're hiding there, at a top level identification. You're not seeing, anything that looks nefarious. And so you're not, alerted and flagging what's going on. They had kind of like a two-stage loader where the initial payload looked like a legitimate Google Analytics tracking code. And then a secondary piece of malware based on site configuration was downloaded for persistence. Okay. They created a command and control channel where that they can maintain in real time, allowing the attackers to basically update without having to reinfect the site. So it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. They can, with that persistent control, try and outpace your attempts to get them off the website. Or, barring your even understanding that they're there, they effectively are able to update their tactics, change their procedures, take new steps on your site that you might not be aware of. They actually took advantage of one of the problems that I'm going to point out, in the current DSS, which is this notion of, well, if there's a payment form that's coming from a PSP, we must be able to assume that it's legitimate. And if it doesn't look like that payment form, there's going to be a consumer flag, and the consumer will understand what's going on, and they'll bring it to the attention of the merchant. Or we're going to be able to run a security audit, and we're going to be able to see massive forms, of data flying out. Totally flies in the face of all that. They effectively created a fake payment form that deployed only when triggered, and that minimized detection risk during security audits. And basically, we're able to slow and low, just siphon off. And that's one thing you need to understand about these types of attacks as well. They're happy if your site does 6 million or 60 billion transactions, right? They're happy to skim off the top, right? It's one of the reasons we talk about it as eSkimming. They don't need to take all 6 million of your transactions to be happy. They'll take 10,000 of them spread over 3 months. They'll take, 10 million spread over 2 years, right? They want persistent, slow, low, below the radar, to exploit your brand trust, and to continuously be able to, steal data as they go along. Another example, this one actually compromised 35 websites simultaneously. And that kind of gets into that supply chain breach thing that I'm trying to bring up to you. This was a legitimate service that was compromised. And one of the things that these guys try and do, the bad guys try and do, is they'll go after, maybe a new widget that, is gaining popularity. That widget, is from a smaller firm, maybe don't have like super sophisticated and deep, cyber, review on code. not doing a bunch in the sort of software development life cycle side of things. They'll hit those guys, and they're happy to do so because it gives them a one to many in terms of the merchant target. So, they can hit, in this case, 35 websites simultaneously simply by compromising a single point of failure, and turning it basically into, a broader, what in some cases can be like an industry-wide type of problem. Okay. In this particular case, there were dozens of retailers that were effectively, calling on a shared library. They were able to, compromise there, establish a fake live chat widget, which masquerades as a customer support tool, keeping them persistent, in the page. They were able to steal credentials and cache them in the browser so that you're not immediately seeing any network detection, of like this large amount of data flying out. And then after checkout is when they actually exfiltrated the data, when most security monitoring typically relaxes. Okay. So this is just another example I wanted to give you guys of some real world, types of attacks that happen out there. And when we speak about, CSP and SRI and all that kind of stuff, give you some understanding as to why not, right? There's a scope issue with the DSS as well. It relies heavily and exclusively on the payment page. Okay. And, I'm not going to tell you that we don't have clients that we support where payment page focus is all they wanted to do because of compliance. We at least think that's a step in the right direction, but we always try and educate and caution and teach our clients around site-wide concerns related to this threat. And that's just something that like we as, security purists are always trying to bring to the table. So let me talk to you about what I'm talking about. So e-skimming occurs site-wide. It doesn't just happen on the payment pages. Okay. It's like a false understanding of even how these attacks occur. We've already talked about it. It's analytics, tag managers, personalization tools, all the payment forms, things of that nature, right? They're running all over the site. Okay. In fact, we did work with Verizon on the 2024 Verizon PSR, and we went out and we analyzed 7,000 of the world's largest websites, and we found 130,000 scripts, and we found 70 or 80,000, 78,000 of them running on the site-wide footprint, another 50,000 running on the payment page side of things. With on that environment, 17,000 doing bad things like accessing PII, payment data, credentials, things of that nature, stuff to worry about. But the fact that the entirety of the site is where these scripts are running, and the fact that once a compromise occurs, enables an adversary to do some pretty bad things that I'm going to get into on this next slide, means that solely focusing and isolating our view at payment page protection is bad governance. It's just end of story. Bad governance. Iframes alone don't stop upstream compromise. Site-wide and parent page JavaScript remains exposed. And so here's some stuff on the right hand side. I think Scott probably put a link to this Coalfire white paper in the chat. Grab that. But I will bring you to calling out a research report that was put out in March by Security Metrics, where they said they've done 2,000 forensic investigations involving eSkimming, and in 100% of the cases, 100% of the cases, the problem wasn't related to the payment page. It was related to the referring page, or otherwise referred to as the rest of the site. Now, why and how is that, right? It's because JavaScript can do a lot of really powerful stuff. And once it's compromised, it basically can change the website and change the flow. Okay. They can add and change page content. Okay. Meaning they can replace your checkout button with a button under their control that takes them somewhere else outside of your even payment page. Okay. They can record keystrokes. They can add form fields that shouldn't exist. So they can ask for card data upstream when you might just be asking for, I don't know, something from the consumer related to login or joining, your loyalty programs. They can capture data, exfiltrate data, and they can redirect visitors to websites under the attacker control. So if I compromise your site, I don't need to compromise your payment page in order to dupe your consumers into an e-skimming attack. Okay. And I don't need to wait until they even get to the payment page before I even start stealing other important things like, credential data, which can get them logged into, that client or that consumer's, cart and their back end and, get them on that end of things as well. You got to focus on a site-wide protection if you really want to stop e-skimming. Again, the DSS is there. It says page. We say site. Others in the industry say site. Clients of ours have bought just the compliance. We will work with you on that, but we're going to caution you the whole way through, and we're going to say you need to be thinking about full site-wide protection. And honestly, when we're talking about these types of controls, us, somebody else, I don't care who it is, this is a drop in the bucket in terms of an investment. This isn't like some multi-million dollar investment that you're making, to stop this problem. And so it's a little bit disingenuous, to sort of zero the focus in an attempt to sort of like isolate expense and control, when it really isn't like that, big or significant of a difference between an isolated view and a site-wide kind of view. Okay. This one, I'm really, you're going to get me on my soapbox on, relates to a lot of the confusion that occurred in the February and March timeframe, right in the lead up, to the requirement to have these controls in place. I kind of think of this as well-intended, completely messed up in terms of its execution, and actually creating like more of a shell game here than actually addressing the problem. And it's related to the changes that were made to the self-assessment questionnaire A. In January of this year, the council came out. They were trying to address the problem of how do we get level 4 merchants, the mom and pops, the people down the street, that do floral or whatever. How do we get them to implement these controls, and sort of undertake more rigor, when they just don't have the technological sophistication and they don't have the financial means. And what the problem is they made a change to SAC-A in an attempt to address the mom and pop community, not knowing, because the council itself does not have visibility into, they're not what's referred to as a compliance reporting organization. They do not get your ROC or your SAC. Your merchant acquirer gets that. And your merchant acquirer attests to your compliance to the card brands. So the council itself is a standards body, but not a governance body. And so they, erroneously understood the use of SAC-A. They thought it was isolated to the mom and pop communities. There are level 1 merchants that use SAC-A all the time because there are FAQs that enable at the, QSA and the level 1, to, if they meet the eligibility criteria, isolate that particular channel to a different form of compliance. And so the bigger targets in the world, have been given, sort of a loophole, and the smaller targets in the world have been like completely, confused, and mislined, in terms of what their requirements are, because there was a change that came post SAC-A change that changed it back. And I'll get into all that, right? But, ultimately, we warned against it. The same 80 members that said no CSP SRI said, what are you doing? Do not do this. QSAs have gone on record, massive issue, quote here from Trusted Sec. They're just saying like, only a few weeks before the future data requirement deadline, you normally ask for stakeholder commentary and changes to help identify or clear up confusion. You never did that. In this case, it's hard to understand why you would remove requirement 643 and 1161 from the SAC. So what did it do? So basically they came out and they said the SAC-A effective April 1st only changed for SAC-A eligible merchants. No change, and said, removal of 643 and 11.6.1, which are the controls that are commonly referred to as eSkimming, from payment page security, and requirement 12.3.1, which is the targeted risk analysis. They removed that from requirements under SAC-A. But if you want to do that, they changed the eligibility criteria in SAC-A to say that you as a merchant must confirm that your site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the merchant's e-commerce systems, right? So effectively, they said you don't have to do these controls because the controls might be onerous, but you got to make sure if you don't do these controls or to be eligible for SAC-A, that you confirm that your site is not susceptible to attacks. I don't know how you could do that. We've spent 10 years in this industry. I'm here on the soapbox like, once a month at least. that's flying in the face of why the controls are in the DSS in the first place. It's because no one was implementing controls that these attacks occur. How can you say that your site is not susceptible if you don't have controls in place? It's one of these things I get a little frustrated on, folks. You probably hear it in my voice, right? They had to come back and they had to change it with FAQ 1588. Now, here's a lot of what happens in PCI compliance. And if you're not using a QSA, you can get yourself lost by trying to follow the bouncing ball. You've got the DSS, and then you've got other documents that refer back into it, inclusive of clarification statements that are made and FAQs that are put out. And there's numbers affixed to them. In this case, this one's 1588. And so if you only read the DSS, you might miss out on the fact that there have been other definer documents that you need to refer to understand the true scope of the problem. And that's really where expertise comes into play. And where one of the things when we talk about in terms of we'll do this for free for you is kind of helping you understand how to scope this stuff, right? But they came back out, February, they announced mid-January, came back, late February, and they said, okay, wait, we got to clarify this thing. So we said in the requirement that the merchant has confirmed that their site's not susceptible to attacks from scripts that it could affect the merchant's e-commerce system. So they said, well, all right, now we're going to clarify for you how to do that, right? And so here's my friend Animal, with the drum roll. Okay, either use techniques such as, but not limited to those, detailed in requirement 643 and 11.6.1. I'm editorializing now by saying, which we just told you didn't have to do, right? Or obtain confirmation from your PCI compliant TPSP or your payment processor that when implementing according to their instructions, the solution includes techniques that protect the merchant's payment page from script attacks. Okay. There may be some element that can occur there, maybe in a full redirect, obviously, right? Your link goes out. But again, that's just related to the payment process, not related to the website. And so you still could be popped in an eSkimming attack, because the bad guy can redirect to the same way you redirect to your PSP. The other side of it is completely untenable. They either have to kill all the scripts that are running on your site, and they effectively become like a killer to your site performance, or they have to somehow be able to look into your security stack and tell you that like your site is not susceptible. One thing I will bring up is this notion of like a hardened iframe, this notion of again I mentioned it previously, like the consumer being able to spot and understand. We're seeing more and more and more attacks that use fake legitimate looking, like fully cloned iframe elements and override the PSP iframe embed, and that effectively like use that false sense of security to compromise and to steal data. Okay. I don't want to go too far into that one, but I can give you a 5-minute rundown, one-on-one on the attack there. We see it all the time. You should be checking our research, our source defense research page. Scott, you can post a link to that one as well for anybody that wants to go down that wormhole. But ultimately, I'm running out of time a little bit, so I want to keep going. All right, number 4, a big issue that I have, which I can soften my stance on a little bit, in the sense that, if you have a really rock solid security operation going on inside your merchant environment, then, chances are, a detection based solution, is something that, could work for you. Okay. But, if that's not the case, if you're spread thin, like many are, if you've got other systems and a massive footprint that's got to get reviewed, this notion of detect and respond, which they've enabled inside the DSS. See, the DSS says you have to alert on and respond to compromise or malicious identification of malicious compromise. It doesn't say you have to automatically block it, but automatic blocking and behavioral based controls exist, like ours, like others in the market, that should just stop the threat dead in its tracks. The problem that I find with, sort of like not saying go find a prevention first type of strategy, and where we, emphasize our conversations with our clients, goes back to just the fact that I've been in cybersecurity for 18 years and IT for nearly 30, and that I'm old enough to remember what happened in 2013 with the Target breach. Okay. There was a lot of mudslinging that went back and forth, on that massive breach, which was, one of the largest in history, dwarfing the previous largest in history, which was Cart Systems, which gave dawn to PCI DSS way back in 2005. In this particular case, right, there were alerts that were firing off from FireEye. The SOC couldn't keep up with the alert volume. They missed them. And so the breach occurred, even though there was a detection and a response strategy in place. And so, I would emphasize we should get away from this notion of detect and respond or alert and respond and just get into prevention first. Layer of behavioral control over top of the scripts that are run on the site. Like apply, rules that don't allow for bypass. If the bad guy tries to hit the site, tries to do something that script, isn't allowed to do, it won't happen. And then your teams don't have yet more piles of work on their shoulders, in a world where, they can barely keep above water with what they're already doing. So, again, there could be a place for it, but, I'm an advocate for prevention first. Well, we do have those resources I mentioned, that I want you to avail yourselves of. We'll happily help you understand scope. We'll happily help you understand, more of a deep dive on the CSP, SRI, DIY, things that clients are running into. I'm more than willing, and we're ready, to come in and educate, cross-functional teams, whether it be web dev, cyber, IT, compliance, get them all in a room, and we'll happily come in there and spend time with you. We do have a web assessment tool that if you don't even know what's running on your site right now, you should. That's like step one, right? Acknowledgement of an understanding of the issue. We will do a group session with your QSA. Chances are we probably know them by name. It definitely know them by the company that they work for. And then we've got this rapid action plan, which could be 30 days or it could be less, depending upon how quickly, you want to get moving. I also provide here my email address. It's steve@sourcedefense.com, because I don't want you to be shy. You can reach out. You can ask me, for guidance, advice, help, whatever, anytime. And so, feel free to follow up with that. Take action, get on top of this, think outside the box. Don't just read what's in the DSS. Think about security first. Push your envelope a little bit. You're not going to break the bank. These are all themes I want to leave you with. That and happy holidays.